Yo, yo, what's going on? This is going to be part 2 of my reaction with Jordan Peterson. We Who Wrestle with God tour. This is my part 2. So if you're watching this video and you're watching the replay from live, I would recommend you'd probably need to skip a little bit forward because I'm going to test some of the audio right now.
All right, so let's wander through that a little bit. You see the world through a story. The rationalists or empiricists, even the biologists, they might have an answer to that. They say, okay, fair enough, you see the world through a story, but the story is biologically determined or socioculturally determined. It's a story of sex, that would be Freud, because for Freud and for Charles Darwin, for that matter, for Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, to an equal degree, the story, the aim is sex, reproduction, and the story is predicated on that aim.
Okay.
Freud,
I hear the
Darwin,
audio just fine.
Dawkins.
Let's get this.
The degenerate element of that is a descent into a kind of hedonism. Because if sex is
Here we go.
the story, then why not worship sex? And some dispute that and say, no, the central story isn't sex. This would be the Marxists. The central story is power. That's the story that the universities tell when they're not telling the story about sex. It's all about power. The essential human aim is domination, oppression, victimization, exploitation. The central theme of the family is a power dynamic. The central theme of the relationship between men and women is a power dynamic. Marriage itself is a heteronormative, patriarchal establishment of oppression that goes back to the dawn of time. The nuclear family is the same thing. Economic arrangements are nothing but power. Friendships are nothing but power. The landscape of human interaction is a dynamic of power, or sex, or both fighting against one another. Look, these are powerful ideas. Why? Well, it's obvious why. I mean, first of all, without sex, there's no reproduction, and without reproduction, there's no people. And so the Darwinian, Freudian, Richard Dawkins selfish gene claim is that, well, what could it possibly be other than sex? And the Marxists come running forward and say, how about power? A sophisticated play, a Shakespearean play, or you read a sophisticated work of fiction, you see a multi-dimensional characterization, right? A comic book has a hero with one motive.
There we go.
A sophisticated work of fiction has a hero, and perhaps an anti-hero, with complex, multi-dimensional motivations. Whatever characterizes those more realistic people isn't reducible to any single attribute. And in a complicated work of fiction, the author walks you through a multi-dimensional characterization. You see the same person, the hero, aiming upward, the anti-hero or villain aiming downward. You see that person portrayed in multiple different situations, and pursuing partial reflections of their ultimate aim. And in consequence of that, you learn to understand and embody that complex of aims. When you see a movie and you watch the hero, you're watching the hero to learn how to act like a hero. When you're watching a movie and you watch the anti-hero or the villain, you're watching the movie to learn how not to fail catastrophically and land in hell while taking everyone else along with you. Is it reducible to something as simple as power or sex? Not if it's not a comic book. You need a multidimensional characterization. All right. The biblical corpus provides a multidimensional characterization of the fundamental aim of man and cosmos. That's the claim of the book. So
Hold on. I got to replay that part. I feel like what he's saying right there is simple, but he's using a lot of big words. Let me replay. I'm black. I got to go back. I'm just messing. It's a joke. Hold on.
Provides a multidimensional. All right. The biblical corpus provides a multidimensional characterization of the fundamental aim of man and cosmos. That's the claim of the book. So I'm going to...
Let me try to summarize what I think I'm hearing him say. He's saying that the Bible is a multi-dimensional story. Different stories to explain the fundamentals, he said, of the cosmos, of the creation of the universe. I don't know. It went over my head. It went over my head. Let me go.
Walk you through some of the stories and show you what's being revealed.
Okay.
What's being revealed is the proper object of worship. Okay, so what does that mean?
God.
The proper object of celebration. The aim towards which all sacrifices and work are to be directed. That which should be held in the highest regard. That which should be imitated in ritual and admiration.
I think he's
so
referring to God.
That's the idea. Admiration in the same way that a small child who hero worships the boy down the street who's the baseball star, because that boy portrays a pattern of skill and attention that is the next appropriate developmental step for the hero worshiping child. That's a recreation of the religious impulse. The impulse to look up, admire, and imitate. The question being, to what should we address our attention, upward looking, admire, and imitate? That highest possible object of apprehension and admiration is by definition God. It's a definition. It's the highest aim that lurks behind all proximal aims. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's the upward aim as such. All right, how do you bring that down to earth? Well, let's start with Genesis 1. There's a characterization of God and man in Genesis 1. The story opens at the dawn of time, at the beginning of things. That's not exactly the beginning of time. That's usually how it's read, but it's more complex than that. It's not only the beginning of time in the linear sense, but it's the beginning of all things that begin. This is what happens every time something begins. This is what happens every time something new makes its entry into the world. It's the continual beginning that continually unfolds, that happened and is happening now and will always happen. It's the pattern of the emergence of order out of chaos that makes itself manifest in the form of your life.
I gotta slow down. Sometimes, all right. I feel like he's trying to say something very simple, but he uses a lot of big words, so I need to break down what I think he's just saying. I think to simplify what he's just saying, he's just talking about the scriptures are referring to just how the world was created in the beginning. Not from not the beginning of God, but just the beginning of creation. That's what it sounds like to me. Let me continue.
How is the stage set? The Spirit of God hovers over the water, over the deep. You hear that in the Judeo-Christian tradition. God engenders the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's not how the story sets itself up. It sets itself up with the Spirit of God hovering above the waters, but it's not water. That's not the word. Water is one of the symbolic images, attempting to make what's being described clear using a sequence of complex metaphors. The word for the water over which the Spirit of God hovers is tohu vabohu, or tehom, and it means a lot of things. It means the dragon that lives at the bottom of the deepest well. It means the unplumbable depths of the most abysmal ocean. It means the water that brings forth life. It means the infinite well of possibility itself. It means the confusion that reigns when your world falls apart.
Okay, hold on. Oh, man. Okay. You know what? I'm going to write down what water, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. That's a word that, whatever the Hebrew word is for that, I guess I'm going to have to do some research on this, because there are different resources that I can go to, but they're all going to say something different. Man, this notepad's almost full, bro. Water. Hebrew. Question mark. That means I have to look it up whenever I put a question mark in something. Let me continue listening.
It means the
dragon?
Structured day that makes itself manifest when you wake up.
Hold on a sec. Let's see what we have here. Doozy Talks, never heard it described like this. Yeah, me neither. I'm trying to understand what he's talking about.
It means all of that. It means the dragon that the archaic God sliced into pieces and made the world from. It means it's the Hydra that Hercules defeats to form the world. It's all of that. So what does that mean? It means that the spirit of being and becoming generates the world from possibility. What does that mean? That's what your consciousness does. That's what you do.
Hold on, let me go back.
You think you're surrounded by a world of objects that you manipulate in a robotic do. What does that mean? World. It's all of that. So what does that? It means it's the Hydra that Hercules defeats to form the world. It's all of that. So what does that mean? It means that the spirit of being and becoming generates the world from possibility. What does that mean? That's what your consciousness does. That's what you do. See, you think you're surrounded by a world of objects that you manipulate in a robotic fashion, but you're not concerned with the objects that are static. You're concerned with what you can dynamically transform. When you wake up in the morning, what presents itself to you is a field of indeterminate opportunity. That's why you're worried, or perhaps excited, because you have something to grapple with that hasn't yet come into being. The possibilities of the day, and you might think, oh my God, I have so many things to do. I'm overwhelmed. It's too much. Well, that's the tohu vabohu. That's the chaos and confusion. That's a plethora of possibility. You're thinking, oh my God, how many ways are there for things to go wrong? Well, that's the multi-headed serpent that the hero always confronts. And what do you have to do with that? It's like, well, are you going to establish the order that's good in the course of the day? Because that's what you're called upon to do. And it's your recreation of what God himself does at the beginning of time that constitutes the action of your conscious on the possibility that's in front of you. You have a microcosm of plenitude and possibility.
All right, so let me think about this. So it sounds like to me he's saying that the water in the Bible from when God was hovering over the face of the water, face of the deep, that the Hebrew word or whatever it is not actually water. It was something that God had to overcome in order to create the world. Some sort of darkness, some sort of it's symbolically it's water. That's what it sounds like he's saying. But it was really something else that God had to like overcome. Or I don't know, maybe this is just going over my head. I'm trying to understand what this guy's saying. It's like he speaks mysteries. Hold on.
Possibility right in front of you at any moment that you can wrestle into order if your aim is right. The process that God relies on to extract the cosmos, the order that's good, from the well of unformed possibility is the word. It's the logos. Well, what does that mean? How much hell can you bring into being by saying the wrong words to your wife? Right, now your wife is who she is, but she's also who she could become, as you've no doubt noticed many times. And you can extract out something good or something terrible from the possibility she represents with the cautious and loving application of your words, or with the careful and prideful and dismissive application of your words. And the world you live in will be radically different depending on which of those two approaches you apply. And that will be exactly the same with anyone else you talk to, and how you treat yourself, and how you interact with the world as such. Because there's a provision of possibility that you're offered as a participant in the process of creation that you formulate in accordance with your aim. What's the insistence in Genesis 1? Aim up with love. So if you want to establish the paradise of your household in relationship to your wife and your children, you aim at what's best for the best in them. You offer them the security that you can imagine. That's the walls of the walled garden. And you present to them the challenge that allows them to unfold and develop optimally. And you do that appropriately if you're aiming at what's best, what's highest. And that's the Spirit of God that
What's good,
makes
Anthony?
itself manifest on the waters of possibility. That's the embodiment.
I am trying so hard to comprehend everything that Jordan Peterson is talking about. So far, let me kind of backtrack. He's talking about, this is his tour called We Who Wrestle with God. And in the beginning of this, I started yesterday, and he was talking about how he was giving these examples about how children play with each other. You know, they wrestle with each other, or they play house. And he was saying how they try to emulate the world, or like, and then the example that came into my mind was a lion and their cubs. And, you know, they play fight, and they will often, when they're play fighting, they'll go for the neck. It's like they're emulating hunting. And, or if we go see a movie, and if you go see a scary movie, you're not watching it just to be entertained. It is entertaining, but we don't watch movies to be entertained, he was saying. But he was saying that why would you put yourself through a scary movie? People often will sit behind and watch a scary movie, and they'll hide behind their chair. Why would you put yourself through that kind of hell? He was saying, and he was saying that we unconsciously want to put ourselves in situations where we won't be harmed, but it's practice for the real world. That's why you see a scary movie, because it's scary, but you want to be able to face the demon. You want to be able to face the thing that scares you in a way where it doesn't harm you. And that's why children play with each other, and they wrestle with each other, different things. So they're like emulating the real world just in case in the future they have to confront something challenging. Now, with that in mind, his tour is called We Who Wrestle with God. And I'm like, okay. So, and he gave an example of how men and women, when they're married, there is how did he put this? He was saying that how when a man and a woman come together, they're the same, but they're different, right? And they come together and they push against each other, but there needs when there's a child in that life, they need that masculine man in the home, but they also need that feminine woman in the home. But these things are opposite, but they push against each other, and they bring a proper balance. And so it's like, okay, what does he mean by we who wrestle with God? It seems that Jordan prefers to use metaphors to describe something simple because he finds a very deep psychological meaning behind it. Oh yeah, I agree with that 100%. So we who wrestle with God. Now, but at the point that I'm at right now, he gave an example about how when God was hovering over the face of the water in the beginning of Genesis, before God created the world, he was saying that the water is actually symbolic of, I can't even explain it that way he said it, but he used the word dragon and darkness and then he was saying that it's consciousness and all these different things. So it's more than just water. The Bible is using the word water as a symbol. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's very intriguing to me. But yeah, let's see what else.
The source, the initial source, and the spirit of upward aiming ultimate love. You can understand this by understanding what sort of walled garden you produce in your own household with your aim. God wrestles with the possibility that's not yet manifest and creates the cosmic order as a consequence, in sequence, creating the fundamental divisions to begin with. The separation of light and darkness, that's the phenomenology of day and night. The separation of the land from the waters, the establishment of the dome of the sky over the disk of the earth, populates the world with its created beings, and on the sixth day produces man and says in his own image. So now we have a characterization of God who's the dynamic process that gives rise to order from possibility itself, in keeping with the highest possible aim, and we have a characterization of the human being as a microcosm of that process. The notion that each of us has a worth that's transcendental and not given by the state, not given by yourself, not given by other individuals, is predicated on that image. I mean that historically, and I mean it conceptually. The notion is that, one of the notions is that the state itself has to grant to you the worth of someone created in the image of the Creator himself, in order even for the state to exist, maintain itself, and transform. That the state itself cannot function unless it establishes a sacred boundary between its operations and the operation of the psyche, the human spirit, that's a manifestation of the God who generates the order that's good from possibility.
As your business grows, the workload can become here to be right now and free.
And you might ask, well, who believes that? And I would say, try talking to one person once without believing that and see how it goes. We call to each other all the time, especially in our intimate relationships, to be treated as if we are the locus of value. And if you treat people that way, if you regard them that way, if you perceive them that way, if you encourage them in that pathway of development, everything in your interactions with human beings will open itself up to you and fill your life with abundance. Everyone wants to be treated that way. And the reason for that is it's in keeping with our essential nature. And that hospitable, welcoming, encouraging, upward aiming, loving treatment is the aim and attitude upon which the soul, the community, and the natural order itself depends for its integrity.
All right. Anthony said the dissolution of the family is the dissolution of the entire society. Explain what you mean, G-Dog. Explain.
Your country is predicated on that notion. The idea that each of you is endowed with inalienable
I'm black. You're using big words, bro. Dissolution. Solution. Dissolution.
rights and their requisite responsibilities is a direct reflection of that conceptualization. And one of the things you might...
All right. Anthony says, the family is the foundational unit for reproduction because it's the only qualified unit for effective and total development. I agree. Amen.
frequently remind yourself of is the fact that your country wouldn't be what it is, which is the closest approximation to a shining city on the hill that's been established so far in the travail of mankind without that fundamental conception. Right? So then, you might say, well, is it true? And the answer is, it's not hell. I mean that, because lots of countries are hell. And they're hell in a way that opens up into an abyss and has the possibility of a deeper abyss waiting latent within it, which will open up with the possibility of a deeper abyss within that. And
so, all right, you gave further explanation. That's good. All right. Society, Anthony says, society is a reflection of the condition of the family. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, man. That's why family is under attack. It is under attack.
And that's what happens.
Let me pause real quick. So, man. So I'm following Jordan Peterson. I'm grasping a lot of what he's saying. He just uses a lot of big words. I got to get used to the way he communicates because I kind of dig it. You have to read between the lines. Unless you're really paying attention, you're not going to understand what this guy's saying.
When that fundamental characterization is overthrown in a revolutionary manner or carelessly abandoned. And we saw that for all of us who are non-believers and no longer conceptualize the metaphysical hell as real, we saw the metaphysical hell realized in the 20th century many times. In case anyone, having abandoned their metaphysical presuppositions, was so blind that only an object lesson would suffice. Right? Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union under Stalin, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao, if that isn't close enough to hell for you, then I would say you should pray that you aren't introduced to something even worse for the purposes of convincing you about what's real. In the second, God announces four things once he creates man. He says, man is to tend the garden. That's his purpose. Why a garden? It's a walled garden, actually, because that's what paradise means, walled garden. Why a walled garden? Well, a garden is a place of nature, obviously, and walls are a place of culture. And a walled garden is a place of nature encapsulated in a manageable manner by the walls of culture. That's what your backyard is. It's a yard, it's nature, it has walls. The walls are culture. The walls you could think of as physical entities, as objects, but your lawn has borders if you don't have a fence. And your neighbors know where the borders are. And where are the borders? Well, they're in the imagination of your neighbors. I'm dead serious about that. The walls, it's so funny because you'll see people in the border between Canada and the United States. They'll get out and they'll step across the border. It's like, as if it's an object, as if it's an entity that's there on the ground. And people know that that's magic in some sense because the grass in Canada is only slightly less healthy than the grass in the United States, let's say. It's easy to concretize that, but the idea of a walled off space in a communal society is a social agreement. You have your domain, your house, your garden, your backyard. That's enough cosmos for you to set right. And perhaps if you're competent enough to do more, you'll expand your garden so that you have more to tend.
Oh.
But you start with a walled garden of some size. And if you tend it properly, then the promise is that as your competence grows, so will your dominion.
What? I see what he's saying,
Man sent
man.
to tend the garden and to name everything that's in it. This is Adam. What is it? What does that mean? Well, it's the logos again. It's a re-representation of the creative spirit of God that makes itself manifest when time begins and when new things come into being. Our ability to name, our ability to speak is that in the microcosmic manner. That's what we're capable of doing. That's what the patriarchal spirit does, is name and order the world. And God brings everything to Adam to see what he'll name them. And that's a reflection of the idea that we have a created order, but man has a place in it. And the place is to organize it and to put everything in its proper place and to assign it its identity.
Wow. Okay, so let me discuss the points that he had just made. Anthony said a few things. He referred to hell. He said a hell we haven't been trained for, but then he said, enlarge my territory. So, wow, this is very intriguing to me, man. Where he goes into talking about how he's done a lot of research on the Hebrew and the Greek. I could tell when he's breaking down these words and his terminology and the deep-rooted meanings and going back to the beginning of time of how we're a reflection of God and how we're supposed to tend the garden. And the more you can manage, the more you can tend, the more you get to manage over. And I've never heard him break it down the way he's doing it. And he used the word dominion. And so let me try to break down so far what I think he's getting to. He went into breaking down the nature of God, how God created the universe. But he's saying that mankind is similar to where we are also creators. If I were to just break it down into a few sentences to simplify everything he was trying to say. And again, unless you're really paying attention to reading between the lines, what this man's saying, you're never going to get what he's saying because he uses a lot of big words. But I'm okay with that, man. I'm okay with that. So if you guys have any thoughts, let me know. Now, let's continue. We're getting through this, almost done.
And that's no different than the prioritization of attention that's part of the story. Name things in relationship to their function. Put things in place in relationship to their...
Oh, then the other point. that I wanted to make was when he said that as mankind, when he was talking about how we named the animals, or Adam named the animals, man, that he's using the word patriarchal. Sounds to me, Jordan Peterson is saying that mankind is here to bring order. We are to bring order because we've been given that authority. Now, I'm wondering how this ties into the idea of we who wrestle with God. Because he's talking about how we reflect God, but I want to understand what he means when he says we who wrestle with God. Let's continue.
Significance in the hierarchy of being. Orient all named things upward. Sequence, constrain, organize, and order. The manifestation of the patriarchal spirit.
Let them
what
have
does
dominion.
God decide? That's not good enough.
Kingly rulership.
Man lacks a helper. Man needs a helper. Woman's created as a consequence because the order that men produce, because of their limitations, is insufficient. And something has to be introduced to speak for that which is not included. That's the role of woman. That's the biblical role of the woman. It's the biological role of the mother. You know this in your own household. Women bring the concerns of the marginalized to the center. You can think about that politically, and it's useful to think about it politically. All established human orders exclude. The exclusion causes pain. The pain of exclusion requires a voice. That's the voice of the eternal mother. That's where Genesis 1 ends. Genesis 2 contains the story of Adam and Eve. It's another creation story. It's commensurate with the first one. It's a variation on a theme. God creates Adam out of matter, earth, and breath, spirit. Why? Because that's what human beings are. We're material creatures that are animated. Anima means spirit. What's the spirit? The spirit is the living organizing principle of the material. And human beings are an amalgam of the living organizing principle and the material. And that's what's portrayed in the creation of Adam. The combination of matter and spirit, the combination of material and conscious. You could think about it that way if you're more secular minded. We're conscious matter. What's up with that? No one understands that. No materialist understands that. We understand nothing about consciousness. It's as mysterious now as it's been throughout the entire course of our existence. It's never been reduced to a material phenomenon. We have no idea what that would even mean. And if we did reduce it to the material, all that would mean was that we inadvertently elevated the material. We treat each other like we're conscious. We presume from first principles that we're conscious. We can't even distinguish between being itself and being conscious. And so that's a perfectly reasonable representation of man. Woman is taken from man, from a rib, from the side, as an equal. There's a critique of patriarchal Judeo-Christian narrative from the resentful feminist side that makes the claim that the biblical narrative is, for example, radically patriarchal in its orientation, dooming women to subjugation. That's a preposterous claim, by the way. It's not only false, it's false in a very particular way. There are falsehoods that are approximations of the truth. There are falsehoods so deep that they're the exact opposite of the truth. And the truth of the matter is that right from the first words, the biblical library is miraculous in its insistence that women, like men, are made in the image of God. That emerges in the first chapter. And that Eve is the equal of Adam in every manner, although complementary and not identical. And our society is riven by conflict so deep that we now doubt both of those propositions. There's no form of confusion more profound than that. Sexually reproducing creatures without nervous systems can tell the difference between male and female. I'm dead serious about that. If you can get people to swallow the lie that there's no difference between men and women, there is no lie they won't swallow. Right.
That's true.
So, God makes Adam and Eve, each with their own role, and he puts them in the garden to play forever under the watchful eye of their heavenly Father. And he tells them they have free reign in the garden with everything delightful that's been created, except for one thing. They're not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Here we go. I bet he's about to say something deep. He's probably about to say something deep.
Man, that's a mystery. I spent a long time trying to crack the micro narratives in the story of Adam and Eve. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 years ago that I think I started to understand that particular fragment of the story. A friend of mine, he is here, Jonathan Pajot. Some of you might have been following him. Jonathan and his brother Matthew really helped me crack this. And so we're here. I'm here with Jonathan and a number of my other colleagues and friends right now with the Daily Wire recording another seminar. We released an Exodus seminar. We're recording a seminar on the Gospels right now. We're about 60% of the way through that. And so, just so you know, that's also forthcoming. God tells human beings, he makes one fundamental rule. Do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, that's moral knowledge. That should be self-evident, knowledge of good and evil. That's moral knowledge. Moral knowledge is predicated on the idea that there's an upward path and a downward path, that there are desirable things and that there are undesirable things, and that at the pinnacle of what's desirable is what's heavenly or paradisal, and in the abysmal depths of what's undesirable is the diabolical and the hellish. And that's the moral landscape. That's the landscape of good and evil. That's the fictional landscape. Fictional in the sense of characterization and plot. Fictional in the sense of distilled truth, not falsehood. Fictional in the sense that the fiction describes the structure through which you see the world. Fiction as the deepest form of truth. What does it mean to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? When Nietzsche announced the death of God in the late 1800s, he said something that he believed would constitute a pathway forward. He said, "We have dispensed with God. We are the greatest murderers who ever lived. We've engaged in a murder so profound that will never wash away the blood. How could we possibly conduct ourselves in the aftermath of that murder?" You read of Nietzsche as a triumphant anti-Christian. He was a very complicated person, and he knew perfectly well that the dissolution of the Christian metaphysic would produce a cataclysmic consequence. He predicted in the late 1800s that Europe would turn to a radically resentful egalitarian communitarianism that would kill tens of millions of people, which is exactly what happened. And he saw that coming just as clearly as his Russian counterpart Fyodor Dostoevsky saw it. He knew what would rise in the aftermath of the death of God. He knew that resentment and communitarianism would be one temptation. And he tried to formulate an alternative path. He said, we're going to have to create our own values. We're going to have to take it upon ourselves to create the moral landscape. I read that and I understood why he said that. I could see its influence on clinical psychology, for example, the notion of the self-actualized person, the notion that our soul should unfold in the direction that's commensurate with the deepest understanding of our subjective selves, right? The radical unveiling of subjectivity, self-definition. I am what I say I am, which is a radical claim in our society now. A claim of omniscience. Not only am I who I say I am, you better act like I'm who I say I am. That's the claim of the radical subjective. Well, what's wrong with that claim? Well, the psychoanalysts criticized Nietzsche very effectively. They said, look, how are you going to create your own values when you're not master in your own house? Have you tried telling yourself what to do? How does that work for you? I know, you're just your own obedient servant, right? You're so morally pure. You just tell yourself at New Year's that you're going to go to the gym and you're going to diet and you're going to be some stellar physiqued, lean, mean fighting machine by March, and you go once and then you tell yourself lies about why you don't have to go again, and that's the end of that. And if you were capable of creating your own values, you wouldn't be the banner, the tattered banner that blows in the wind of its own whims. The psychoanalysts figured this out very quickly. You're a war of competing whims. And a creature like that's going to have a very difficult time navigating the complex landscape of the ultimate moral pronouncement. Who are you to make a decision about what constitutes good and evil? And that's what God tells men and women. It's like, you don't get to create the moral order, you get to dwell within it. You get to align yourself with the pre-existent moral order. You do not take to yourself the right, the presumption to define good and evil themselves.
Okay, so let me pause right here just for a sec and let me break down where I'm at with what he's talking about right now. So far, when he broke into the story of Genesis and talking about eating from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, and how even from the beginning he was talking about how a lot of this is metaphorical. And he's like, what does it mean eating from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil? What does that mean? Eating from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And when you look in the scriptures and different things, you see that word fruit a lot, like be fruitful and multiply. And that word fruit is used in many different ways. That's I wrote down notes because I'm like, okay, I need to do some more digging on this terminology because I've looked it up already, but I'm like, the Bible is simple and profound at the same time. And I can't count the amount of times where I've studied something and had an epiphany, had a realization, and gained some understanding on something, and it blew my mind. But then when I came back to that same thing and did more research on it, and it hit different. And you can read the same passage 1,000 times and it hit you different 1,000 times. It's like, what in the world's going on here? It's the end times. So I'm just playing. But what does that mean from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil? Because he's talking about I don't know if he's saying that it's a fictional story, because he was using the word fiction earlier to describe that even in fictional stories, the ultimate truth can be found in a fictional story because there's a principle in the story. I think I've heard him one time say, though, that he believes that it's also a literal story, but I don't know. These are some great mysteries. Let's continue.
You bow your head to good and you pray for deliverance from evil. And if you violate that, look the hell out. And that's the pronouncement. And so what happens? the serpent offers Eve the fruit. Why the serpent? Well, the serpent is camouflaged. The serpent is crafty, subtle. The serpent is marginalized. The serpent is the voice of pride. The serpent is Lucifer. That's the metaphysical surrounding of the story that develops over centuries, the notion that the serpent in the Garden of Paradise is Lucifer himself, the spirit of pride. What is
I gotta see this comment right here. What's going on here? My boy Fly. What tree do we know of that produces two different types of fruit? None. Let me read that again. What tree do we know that produces two different types of fruit? None. Oh, I got you. Like, because the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I wonder what the symbolic meaning is of this. And also, can you explain it a little bit more, Dr. Fly? Tell me what you mean. Are you looking into the metaphorical meaning of this as well?
What does that mean? It's prideful presumption that makes you assume that you can define the moral order. What's the prideful presumption of Eve at the beginning of time and forever? I can even clasp the serpent to my breast. It's the careless welcoming in of the monstrous and prideful under the guise of the pretension of maternal compassion. And if you can't see that happening in our society, you're blind.
It might be easy to just toss around Oscars true your prayer. Load the hats
I care about
Flash Jordan.
Y'all throwing all these ads up in here, man. Come on now. Praise God. Let's go. Keep going.
And what's the sin of Adam? Well, what do men care about? Women care properly about the helpless infant. It's a powerful feminine virtue, and it can be inverted and made prideful and trumpeted and presumptuous to infantilize the world and to advertise that compassion as a badge of worth and honor, as a mode of attaining status. What's Adam's sin? What do men care about? Impressing women. Men are ambitious fundamentally to impress women, for better or for worse. What's the prideful pathway and false pathway to establishing a relationship with the too demanding feminine? I've got it. Anything you want, dear. Right, and that's Adam's sin. Eve hearkens to the voice of the serpent and clutches it to her breast, despite the clear injunction from the divine never to do that. And Adam weakly does exactly what the worst part of his wife wants. And so here we are, folks. So what's the consequence of that? Well, the scales fall from their eyes and they notice they're naked. And they're deeply ashamed and they cover up. They become self-conscious. Okay, so when do people become self-conscious? When they make prideful errors. When you overreach and you reveal your inadequacy as a consequence of the mismatch between your pride and your ability. You'll be ashamed. You'll recognize your insufficiency. You'll be aware of yourself as an isolated entity. That's all to become self-conscious. Psychologists have learned over the last 40 years that there's no difference between being conscious of yourself and being miserable. Those are literally the same thing. If you're living a life of other-centered, communally oriented, hospitable calling, you're not attending to the miseries of your isolated self. If you stay in your bailiwick and you don't put forward your hand presumptuously, You can live in the absence of painful self-consciousness. Pride goes before a fall. We have a month devoted to pride in our culture. Right. Pride goes before a fall. You know this in your own life. You can ask yourself, and this has been a Christian conundrum since the beginning of time, is your life miserable because misery is baked into the structure of the world? Or is your life miserable because you do stupid things and refuse to learn and bring endless misery on yourself in your presumption? And you know, you might say a little of column A and a little of column B, and fair enough. But you certainly know that the most painful episodes of your life come when you claim falsely to be more than you are. And the core narrative in the Judeo-Christian ethos is that the fall of man into the profane world is a consequence of pride. And that is really something worth thinking about. You know, Adam and Eve are called upon to work in misery as a consequence of their pride. Well, could you work joyfully? If you didn't overreach yourself, if you were aiming upward properly, if you were telling the truth, if you were acting communally, if you're acting in relationship to what was highest, would it be possible that your work would be joyful and bring abundance? Isn't there times in your life when that's happened? Is it the case that you move forward in misery in precise proportion to the pretension of your aim? It's worth considering. It's the suspicion that arises at the end of the story that begins history, because it's with the prideful fall of Adam and Eve that history begins. Adam and Eve discover they're naked and they hide. And God comes along and says, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm over here. I'm hiding. And God says, well, why are you hiding? It's a foolish thing to do, right? Because Adam is perfectly aware that God can see through bushes. Adam is hiding from God. Is it your pathetic self-consciousness that makes you hide from God? That's a good question. Are you not everything you could be because you're ashamed of who you are? That's what that story indicates. And so God calls Adam on. He says, who told you? Why are you hiding? And Adam says, well, I'm naked. And God says, well, how do you find out that you were naked? How did you find out that you were inadequate? How did you find out that you are shameful? And Adam says, you know that woman you made me? It's her fault. And that's the second sin of Adam. And that's another indication of the non-patriarchal nature of the text. You know, Eve is the first human being to take a bite of the apple, but Adam follows along, and it isn't obvious to me that the follower of sin is in a worse, better moral position than the initiator. And then he calls by blaming the woman. Why is your life so... Well, if you had my wife, man, you'd know. It's like those damn women. It's like, it's a handy excuse for men all the time to say that, and it's not least because men can't tolerate being rejected by women, and women reject them all the time. And the reason women reject them is because they're not all they should be. And so, of course, that makes men painfully self-conscious and makes them shake their fist at God and makes them hide. And so, well, God says, and so Adam reveals himself in this pathetic manner. It's like he can't even take responsibility for his own misstep. He has to blame the thing that's been granted to him as the highest form of gift. And not only her, but God. Whose fault is it? Well, it's not mine. It's probably women's fault. And if it's not women, it's clearly God. It can't be me. So what happens? Well, both Adam and Eve are condemned to suffer in their work. And that's how history begins. And that's the situation of the fallen world. And that's the description of the landscape of profound fiction that we inhabit. And that's only a tiny fraction of the characterization of God and man in the biblical corpus. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, okay. All right. Well, that was Jordan Peterson. What is this? See, come on now. All right. That was fun. Got a lot of research I need to do. Got a lot of learning. And so some of the stuff that I wrote down that I need to do some research on is when he was talking about when God was hovering over the face of the water. What does that really mean? Was it actually water? Because he was saying in the Hebrew it means something else. He was talking about darkness. He was talking about a dragon. He was talking about consciousness. He was talking about it was like the water was something that God needed to overcome in a way. And so if that's symbolic, and then the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, symbolic, all this symbolic stuff, symbols. And, you know, when you first read the Bible when you're a little kid, you're a teenager, when I was going to church and stuff, you know, you read these stories for their literal meaning, but you don't look into the metaphorical meaning. And when you start looking at the metaphorical meaning, it is so deep because let's say, for example, when I think about the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, if I don't look at it as a literal story and just look at it metaphorically for a moment, when she went to go eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, just before she took a bite of that fruit, metaphorically speaking, it looked desirable. Or when you think about the serpent, and the serpent is very subtle, sneaky, and it influenced her to want to, it deceived her to want to eat from this tree. And it's as if that the desire for knowledge, like when the serpent said to her, no, God just knows that if you eat from the tree, you're not going to surely die. He just knows that if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're going to be like him. You're going to be like a god. The idea of wanting to be like a god, to have knowledge of good and evil, to be able to decide what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And how he brought up the example how people want to identify with whatever they want to identify, and everybody else around them just has to accept it. And it's a godlike attribute. And now there's this separation where we're made in his image, we're made in the image of God, but then you have this other thing over here where it's like you are your own separate God. And seeing the symbolic meaning behind that the desire for knowledge, the desire to be like a god, the desire to be like a god is attractive. To have power, to be like God, to have control. And no wonder why they want to eat from the tree. And so if this story is symbolic, if there wasn't a literal fruit, if there wasn't a literal tree, but it was the symbol, that can still apply to today. Because that's how mankind is today. You know, we want to travel to Mars. I watch a lot of podcasts, and there's some things that people talk about that I'm like, man, I did not know that people were into this type of stuff. I mean, it's intriguing to me, certain things such as aliens or traveling into space or trying to create new planets and trying to make human beings and trying to Neuralink and use your mind to control things. This is all stuff that it's not fantasy. Like before in the past, it was all just in a movie. But now this stuff is actually happening in the real life. And that desire to want to be like a god, to have control. And I'm not going to say names or what country or what ruler, but there is a particular person that is alive today that rules a country. And this person wants to be a god. And they are trying to find a way to live forever. And I'm like, this is real life. This isn't like a movie. Like I can imagine a villain from a movie wanting to do something like that, but for someone in real life, and I study a lot of people. I try to study not only history, but people that are alive today, that are powerful people today, and look at things that they have said. And some of the most powerful people in the world that are alive today that rule the planet, basically, have said things along the lines of this, that they've always desired to be a god. Now, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories and go into deep state government and Illuminati and all this kind of weird stuff, but I'm just saying the idea of wanting to be like a god is so attractive. Why is that? And I love how he says when we try to overreach, that's when we experience depression. That's when we experience sadness and anger. When we try to overreach, when we try to step over the bounds. And when you think of Adam and Eve and the symbolic part of that story, they tried to overreach. And then immediately they're kicked out of this garden, quote unquote, garden, heaven on earth, Eden, because they tried to overreach, because they tried to have knowledge that they weren't supposed to have, because they tried to be like gods. Now, when they work, their work is no longer enjoyable. Just living is no longer enjoyable because they tried to overreach. But if they would have never tried to overreach and to try to be like a god, they could have been present and been content with what they have and where they are now, being in the image of God. And that's what comes to my mind when I listen to Jordan Peterson today of what he was talking about. Now, I think in my life when I was a young man, I got to make this quick because I got to go to work. But when I was a young man, I remember getting into witchcraft. Why did I get into witchcraft? I remember I just wanted to have power and control over my life circumstances. And, and when I got into witchcraft, I had some experiences that convinced me that there was a devil. And so I later repented of that and turned away from that. But it convinced me that, oh man, there's some dark powers out there. And when you think about creation, when you think about animals are just, when there's a monkey or an alligator or a dog just does dog things. It's not trying to be a cat. And the cat is not jealous of a dog. It's just doing cat things. And you take a dog, it all sees a random fire hydrant. I'm going to go pee on this random fire hydrant. That's what it does. But human beings, we do things that go against nature. And it's one of those little things that's like an indicator that there's something beyond this world. Like if you're someone who doesn't believe that there is even a God, here is something that contradicts nature. Like if you're into evolution. If you believe in evolution, if you believe in just that there is no God, you believe that all animals just are created to just survive and to reproduce. Survive and reproduce. That's it. Everything that you do in your life is all about survival and reproducing. And such as even getting a job. You get your job so that you can survive, but you also want to get that higher paying job so that you could buy that super nice car and that super nice house so that you can get a nice chick because you have all this nice stuff so that you can reproduce with that nice chick. Okay, great. Not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that's what you think life's all about, typically, from people that I spoke with and from what I've learned. But it goes against nature to want to sit there and say, hey, why would someone want to have thoughts about ending their own life? Why would someone have thoughts about ending their own life? That goes against nature. That goes against survival. And to me, something as small as that convinces me that there is a spiritual war. And so, anyways, now coming to a conclusion on this video, I had fun listening to that. I might do more of these reaction videos. I don't know. Maybe I'll react to different types of content. Maybe not just Jordan Peterson. Maybe I'll react to other people. Who knows? Or maybe I'll continue just doing my speeches, my creed speeches. But yeah, man, getting ready to go to work. God bless. Hit that like button, subscribe, do all those YouTube things, comment. Just before I get off, there's one last viewer. Say something. What's up? Just before I got to go. Who is it? I'm curious. Who's staring at me right now? It's kind of creepy right now. I feel scared. Say hi. Who is this? I'm about to get off in like 30 seconds. Hopefully your comment will pop up. About to hop off. All right, y'all. Well, I guess that's the end of the show. Peace out.